Miss Marple opened the police station door. She held a black umbrella. It belonged to Inspector Slack. He had left it behind yesterday. Miss Marple decided to return it. Inside, she saw Sergeant Draper. He was polishing the duty board. His hands moved steadily, but his face looked worried. The board was covered with fresh linseed oil. The smell filled the room. Miss Marple noticed the board looked cleaner than usual. Draper kept checking his watch. He seemed restless. Was there a reason? Suddenly, Inspector Slack entered the station. His face was tight with anger. He barely greeted anyone. He hurried straight upstairs. Miss Marple watched him go. Something was wrong. The station felt heavy. It was silent. Usually people talked here. Today, it was different. Sergeant Draper stopped polishing. He looked at Miss Marple, but his eyes showed worry. His face looked pale. Miss Marple thought something was going on. Why was Inspector Slack so upset? No one said a word. She held the umbrella tightly. The day had just begun, but trouble was already near. She noticed the quiet in the station. The small movements of the people seemed tense. Everyone was busy but uneasy. Draper glanced at his watch again. He kept wiping the polish carefully. He looked nervous. Slack was still upstairs. What was happening there? Miss Marple did not know. The silence made her uneasy. Something was being hidden. She could feel it. Miss Marple kept looking around. The station felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. She wondered what Slack was hiding. Why was he so angry? The answer was close. Miss Marple held the umbrella tighter. She was ready for what was coming. Her mind raced with questions. Something big was about to happen. She waited quietly. The air was thick with tension. Why was Inspector Slack so agitated? Something was brewing upstairs. Inspector Slack's anger was only the start. Something was happening upstairs that would shake the whole station. Inspector Slack stood by the cell door. He looked grim. Eddie Roscoe was dead, shot through the heart. The cell was locked. No one could enter or leave. The windows were small. No way to pass anything inside. Slack checked the keys. They were with Constable Pike. She had kept them all morning, always on her belt. Constable Pike stood nearby. Her face was pale. She shook as she spoke. "I found him at 11. I brought his tea." Slack frowned. "Did you unlock the door yourself?" Pike nodded. "Yes, I always carry the keys. Station policy." No weapon was found inside the cell. No gun, no knife. Just the body and a stained blanket. Slack looked at the small table in the cell. It held a water jug and an empty cup. Nothing else. He turned to Pike. "Did you hear the shot?" Pike shook her head. The doors were thick. I was far." Miss Marple studied the scene quietly. She looked at the lock carefully. It was stiff, but not broken. "Someone fired the gun from inside," she said softly, "but the door was locked." Slack tapped his chin. "How is that possible?" Pike's hands trembled. "I don't understand it either. I keep the keys always." Slack's eyes narrowed. Was anyone else near the cell this morning? Pike thought. Eddie was brought up to sign papers on Monday. He was alone for a few minutes. "But he was handcuffed," Slack said, "with hands in front. Could he pick a lock?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not likely, but maybe someone else took advantage of that moment." Slack looked at the records. Sergeant Draper signed the log at 9:55. He checked on Roscoe then. Miss Marple pointed, "But the log was altered. There are 2 rosters for today. Which one is true?" Slack frowned. "We need to check all records again." Pike looked worried. "What about the weapon? How could the gun disappear?" "No sign of forced entry," Slack said. "The lock wasn't broken." Miss Marple touched the door lock. "There is fresh oil here. It might have been oiled recently." "Why oil the lock on the day of the murder?" Pike asked. "To make it easier or harder to open." Miss Marple said, or to hide fingerprints. Slack looked at her. Do you suspect someone in the station? Miss Marple nodded. Someone who knows the routines. Someone with access. Pike swallowed hard. But who? Slack stepped back. We must find the truth fast. This case will not wait. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. The timeline is wrong. The door locked. The gun missing. She looked at Pike. If you always have the keys, who fired the shot? If the door was locked, and the keys always with Pike, who fired the shot? Miss Marple returned to the duty board. The smell of linseed oil was strong. It was fresh. Too fresh for early morning. She ran her finger lightly along the edge of the board. The varnish was still tacky, not fully dry. Miss Marple took out a small penknife. She scraped a tiny sample, placed it in an envelope from her bag. Her eyes scanned the surface. There were small flecks of oil on the floor beneath the board. Someone was careless. She looked at the paper on the desk. It had oily fingerprints. They were faint but clear. The fingerprints matched Sergeant Draper's hands, or so she thought. The scent of oil had a strange note. It smelled mixed with turpentine. Miss Marple frowned. Why mix linseed oil with turpentine? She wondered. She turned to Sergeant Draper. Where do you get your linseed oil? Draper looked surprised. From Hammond's Hardware, he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The smell is stronger than usual. Iris Farrow, the clerk, stood nearby. She watched silently. Miss Marple spoke gently. Oil is oil, but there are many kinds. Iris shrugged. I thought it was just polish. Miss Marple's blue eyes studied Draper. Did you apply the oil yourself? Draper nodded. Yes, early this morning, before I started polishing. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Did you get any on your uniform? Draper looked down. There was a faint stain on his cuff. It's messy work, he said quietly. Miss Marple's gaze lingered. The stain looked fresh. She looked at the fingerprints on the paper again. The pattern was unusual, not like normal fingerprints. The oil seemed to spread evenly. Could the fingerprints have been transferred deliberately? She asked. Iris looked confused. Why would anyone do that? Miss Marple's voice was calm. To hide something. She folded the sample carefully. This oil might be more than polish. She noticed the oily smudge on the keys of Constable Pike. They shone under the light. The keys, too, she murmured, also covered with oil and fingerprints. Miss Marple walked slowly to the desk. She bent down, her eyes narrowed. If someone wanted to cover their tracks, fresh oil is useful. It traps fingerprints and dust. She looked around the room. Everyone was quiet. The tension was rising. No one spoke. Miss Marple raised her head. Oil is hiding a secret. She paused. What is it? Her eyes met Draper's. Are you polishing the truth? Could the oil be a cover-up? Miss Marple sat at the desk. Sergeant Mitchell had just shown her 2 duty rosters. Both were for the same day. Miss Marple looked closely. The first roster was posted on the duty board. It showed Sergeant Draper on duty from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. The second roster was found in Draper's desk drawer. It showed Draper off duty from 10 a.m. to noon. The handwriting on both was similar. Both looked like Draper's writing. But the second roster had strange corrections. The ink looked different. Miss Marple frowned. Which one is real? She asked. Sergeant Draper was called to the office. He looked tired. His face showed stress. Miss Marple asked gently, Sergeant Draper, why are there 2 rosters? Draper replied, It's a clerical error. Mistakes happen. Miss Marple studied his face. She saw no strong denial. Why would you create 2 rosters? She pressed. Draper's voice was low. I was worried about my pension. I needed to look more diligent. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So you changed the records to cover something? Draper looked away. I missed a late check last night. I fixed it this morning. Inspector Slack was impatient. This is serious. A man is dead. Miss Marple said, the question is, which roster is true? Which one shows when you were really on duty? Draper looked at the papers. His hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple noticed a faint spot on the roster. It looked like correction fluid. She held the paper to the light. The fluid covered nothing. It was beside the time entry. Sergeant Mitchell added, it looks like someone started to erase something but stopped. Miss Marple turned to Draper. Did you start to change the time but get interrupted? Draper hesitated. Maybe. Miss Marple said, if you were off duty between 10 and noon, where were you? Draper looked uncomfortable. At home. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. But the log says you were here at 9:55, checking on Roscoe. Draper's face turned red. I was here. Yes. Miss Marple studied the room. She thought carefully. She asked, did anyone else have the keys at that time? Draper shook his head. Only Pike and me. Miss Marple looked at the clock. Time was critical. She said, the time you say you were on duty affects the timeline of the murder. Draper looked down. I only wanted to protect my job. Miss Marple said softly, sometimes pressure leads to mistakes. Or worse. She paused. We need the truth. Is someone falsifying records to hide the truth? Chief Inspector Ridley stood in the evidence room. Boxes were open. Papers and items were scattered. Ridley held a ledger. It showed all evidence since 1947. He pointed to a name. Webley revolver, caliber .38. Entered in 1950, Inspector Slack said. That revolver is from the Wickham robbery case. A gang tried to rob a bank. Ridley continued, the revolver has been here since. Checked every year. Miss Marple studied the empty box. The revolver was gone. Ridley asked, when was it last seen? Slack replied, 2 months ago. Sergeant Draper signed the inventory. Miss Marple looked at the box. The lock was not forced. The evidence tape was mostly intact. Ridley frowned. No sign of tampering, but the gun is missing. Pike spoke up. I saw Eddie Roscoe near the evidence room on Monday. He was alone for a few minutes. Slack said, Roscoe was handcuffed. His hands were in front, not behind. Miss Marple nodded. With hands in front, he might have opened a box. Slack shook his head. All boxes locked. Only 3 have keys. Ridley added, the lock on that box shows no damage. Someone used a key or picked it. Mitchell said, it's an old lock. Simple to pick for someone skilled. Miss Marple thought, Eddie was skilled with locks. That was his specialty. Slack said, he got caught trying to pick a safe in broad daylight. Miss Marple looked at the empty space where the gun should be. Who had access to the keys? She asked. Ridley answered, myself, Inspector Slack, Sergeant Draper, and Constable Pike. Pike said, I had the keys all morning. They never left my belt except to sign tea supplies receipt. Miss Marple looked at Pike. Did you notice anything unusual? Pike hesitated. No, Ridley said. We need to find the gun. Who took it, and why? Miss Marple examined the ledger again. She found a faint pencil note beside the gun's entry. Mitchell used a magnifying glass. It says, check weight seems light. Ridley asked, who wrote this? Miss Marple said, it looks like Pike's handwriting. Pike shook her head. I don't remember writing that. I was on traffic duty then. Ridley looked worried. Yet it matches her handwriting. Miss Marple said, someone may be creating a trail. Breadcrumbs to mislead. Slack snapped. This is serious. Someone planned this. Miss Marple agreed. The missing revolver could be the murder weapon. She turned to Pike. If you did not take it, who did? Pike looked frightened. I don't know. Ridley said, we must find it before the killer uses it again. Miss Marple's eyes searched the room. The revolver's disappearance is no accident. Who stole the gun and why? The keys from Constable Pike's belt were taken to Dr. Haddock's lab. The room was quiet. The staff waited anxiously. Dr. Haddock worked carefully. He tested the keys for residue. The process took time. Finally, he spoke. There is gunpowder residue on the keys. He showed the photos and report. Pike sat stiffly. Her face was pale. I never fired a gun, she said quickly. Miss Marple looked at Pike with concern. You say you did not hold the revolver? No, Pike replied. I don't even know how to fire it. Dr. Haddock explained. The residue is mainly on one key. It matches recent gunfire. Slack's face darkened. You had the keys all morning, Pike. Miss Marple raised a finger. Not exactly. The keys were on Pike's desk for 30 seconds. Pike protested. That was only when I signed for tea supplies. Miss Marple nodded. 30 seconds is enough to transfer residue. Ridley was intrigued. How could that happen? Miss Marple said, gunpowder residue does not spread evenly. Usually it is on the hand, where the gun is held. Dr. Haddock added, but this pattern is almost like it was painted on. Slack scoffed. Who would paint with gunpowder? Miss Marple was calm. With a brush or a contaminated cloth, it is possible. She turned to Pike. When you noticed the keys were oily, did you clean them? Pike said, no, I planned to, but Slack called. Then I found the body. Miss Marple asked, was the lock on the cell door working properly? Pike nodded. Yes, but stiff. I had to jiggle the key. Miss Marple thought aloud. Oil traps particles. Fresh oil on the lock would hold gunpowder residue like flypaper. Sergeant Draper stood silently nearby. Miss Marple looked at him carefully. Draper says he oiled the lock early in the morning, she said, but the oil on the duty board was still tacky at 11. Draper replied, different coats dry differently. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Only the cell 3 lock was freshly oiled. She looked at the corridor. Why only that lock? She turned back to Pike. You had the keys all morning, right? Pike confirmed. Always with me. Miss Marple said, then someone touched the lock and keys while the oil was still wet. She looked at the small particles on the lock. Gunpowder residue is there, too. Slack asked, are you saying someone fired the gun and then oiled the lock? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Someone tried to hide evidence and create confusion. Pike looked frightened. But I did not fire the gun. Miss Marple spoke gently. Someone may have planted evidence to frame you. The room fell silent. Is someone planting evidence? Constable Lake sat at the security desk. He had been watching CCTV footage for hours. His eyes were tired but alert. Suddenly, he sat up straight. Look at this, he said. Miss Marple and Chief Inspector Ridley crowded around the monitor. The screen showed the corridor outside the evidence room. For minutes, nothing moved. At exactly 3:02 a.m., a bright white flash appeared. The camera's sensor was overwhelmed. After the flash, the footage went blank. For 5 minutes, no images recorded. Ridley frowned. The camera was on but not recording. Miss Marple said quietly, it looks like someone covered the lens or stopped the tape. Lake nodded. The timestamp kept running, but the video was blank. Ridley asked, was this normal? No, Lake replied. The tape should show continuous footage. Miss Marple looked serious. This is tampering. Someone made sure nothing was seen during those 5 minutes. Ridley turned to Iris Farrow. You were asked how to switch the tapes at 3 a.m., correct? Iris nodded slowly. Yes. Sergeant Draper said he needed to make a training video. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Did Draper say why it had to be at 3 a.m.? Iris said, he said the station would be quiet then. Ridley asked, did you switch the tape yourself? Yes, but I was not here at 3 a.m. I came early that morning to do it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. So the original tape was removed before the blackout. Iris looked frightened. I didn't know anything. I was just following orders. Lake rewound the tape. They watched the corridor before the flash. No one appeared. Then the 5-minute blank. Then the corridor was empty again. Miss Marple said, what happened during those 5 minutes? Ridley demanded, who had access to the evidence room then? Miss Marple thought aloud. Could the gun have been taken during this time? Lake showed more footage from the previous day. They saw Eddie Roscoe entering the evidence room with Pike. Roscoe was alone for 3 minutes. Then Pike left quickly. 40 seconds later, Sergeant Draper appeared. He entered the room and stayed for 30 seconds. Pike protested. I was only gone for 3 minutes. Miss Marple said, the timing is tight. Someone used the moment to act. Ridley looked at Draper. Were you there? Draper said, yes. Routine check. Miss Marple said, routine or not, this is when the gun could have been taken. Lake checked the morning footage. At 6:30 a.m., Draper was seen entering the evidence room again. He stayed for 2 minutes. Then he left, carrying a clipboard. Slack said uncertainly, that might have been normal. Miss Marple shook her head. Normal or not, the flash at 3:02 is a distraction. Ridley asked, what if the gun was taken before and returned after the blackout? Slack replied, the murder was this morning. Miss Marple asked, was it really? Who stopped the camera? Miss Marple asked for a cup of tea. Iris Farrow helped her prepare it. They went to the kitchen. Miss Marple noticed the coal stove. The ashes looked fresh. Something had been burned recently. Iris said, someone burned papers. Sergeant Draper often burns old paperwork. Miss Marple poked the ashes carefully. She smelled the smoke. It was not just coal smoke. There was a smell mixed with the smoke. Linseed oil. Miss Marple found a small piece of paper in the ashes. Most of it was burned. She held it to the light. A few words were still clear. Engine review. Draper short 3 years. Iris looked upset. There was a memo last week about Draper's pension. Miss Marple nodded. What about it? Iris explained. There was a mistake in the records. Draper was missing 3 years of service. Miss Marple said, so if he retires now, he loses a lot of money. Iris said, he was very worried. He wanted to prove the error. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. When did Draper find out about this? Iris said, about 4 days ago. He has been upset since. Miss Marple sat down. A man worried about money might act desperate. Iris nodded. Draper is old. His knees hurt. Night shifts tire him. Miss Marple said, this could explain his behavior. Chief Inspector Ridley came in. We found something in Draper's locker. They followed him to the locker room. The locker was open. Its contents lay on a bench. There was a bottle of linseed oil and one of turpentine. Ridley said, these are the same brands from the maintenance cupboard. Miss Marple looked at the bottles. Both were almost empty. She said, Draper has been using these a lot. Ridley asked, why would he keep personal supplies? Miss Marple examined the bottles. To create a story, to make it look like he was busy. Sergeant Mitchell entered. We found documents behind Draper's filing cabinet. He showed a box of papers about pensions and service records. Miss Marple found a handwritten note on official paper. It read, if something happens to me, check Roscoe's cell. The evidence is there. H.D. Ridley frowned. Who is H.D.? Miss Marple said, The handwriting looks like Draper's, but it is disguised. Iris said, Draper never said he was afraid. Miss Marple said, Why leave a note like that? Ridley asked, What could it mean? Miss Marple said, Maybe it was meant to be found after an incident. She looked around. Draper wanted to protect something. Iris said, Draper heard Roscoe talking about escape plans. Miss Marple said, Draper might have tried to stop it. Slack said, Maybe he wanted to be a hero. Miss Marple said, But things went wrong. Ridley said, Now Roscoe is dead. Miss Marple looked at the burned paper. She said softly, Sometimes desperation is a strong motive. Could desperation be the motive? Miss Marple was examining the items from Eddie Roscoe's cell. Sergeant Mitchell was nearby, cataloging the evidence. Mitchell held up a pair of handcuffs. These don't match, he said. Miss Marple took them and looked closely. One cuff was modern, the other was old. The modern cuff clicked smoothly. The old one was heavy and rough. The lock mechanisms were different. The old cuff needed a different key. Mitchell said, Where did these come from? Pike said quietly, There is a display case in the station's front hall. Miss Marple nodded. Historical police items are kept there. They all walked to the hall. The glass case had many artifacts. There was an empty space where something had been. Slack said, The handcuffs are missing. Miss Marple looked at the lock on the case. No sign of forced entry. Ridley said, Only 3 people have keys to this case. Slack listed them, the Chief Constable, Inspector Slack, and Sergeant Draper. Miss Marple noticed something, a small sticky mark near the lock. She touched it gently. Linseed oil, she said. She sniffed. The smell was strong. Mitchell said, The old handcuffs lock is sticky. Miss Marple said, Someone oiled it recently. Mitchell added, If it was stiff, oil would make it work. Miss Marple looked at Ridley. Test the old cuff for gunpowder residue. Ridley nodded. Like the keys. Miss Marple said, Oil traps fingerprints and residue well. She looked at the group. Why use an old handcuff now? Slack said, Whoever used it wanted to hide something. Pike looked worried. But I don't know who. Miss Marple said, This is another piece of the puzzle. She held the handcuffs. Someone planned this carefully. Ridley said, The old cuff might link to the killer. Miss Marple looked serious, or to a false trail. The group stayed silent. The questions grew. Who used the old handcuff? Miss Marple examined the cell lock closely. The lock was covered with fresh oil. It was still sticky. She bent down and looked carefully. There were dark particles stuck in the oil. She took a small brush and collected samples. Dr. Haddock knelt beside her. These particles could be gunpowder residue, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Oil traps particles like flypaper. She turned to Sergeant Draper. You said you oiled this lock this morning? Draper replied, Yes, part of regular maintenance. Miss Marple studied his face, but the oil on the duty board was still tacky at 11. Draper said, Different surfaces dry at different rates. Miss Marple said slowly, Only this lock was freshly oiled. She looked at the corridor. Why only this one? She turned back to the group. Someone handled the lock while the oil was wet. Miss Marple said, If gunpowder residue is present, someone touched the lock after firing a gun. Slack frowned. Are you saying the killer left residue on the lock? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the oil would keep the residue trapped. She looked at Pike. You had the keys all morning? Pike said, Yes. They never left my belt except for a moment. Miss Marple said, Then someone with gunpowder on their hands touched the lock while the oil was still wet. She looked around the room. This was done carefully. Miss Marple said, "This is not an accident," she said quietly. "Someone planned to confuse the investigation." Slack asked, "But why oil the lock at all?" MissMarple answered, "To hide evidence, to mislead." She looked at Draper again. "And you were here all morning." Draper's face showed no emotion. MissMarple said, "The oil and residue form a pattern." She paused. "A pattern of guilt." She looked each person in the eye. "Who did this?" The room was silent. Who carefully planned this? Inspector Slack checked the logbook again. He frowned. MissMarple watched him silently. Slack said, "Sergeant Draper was seen entering the station at midnight." MissMarple raised her eyebrows. "But he was off duty then." Slack nodded. "Yes. The roster shows he was off from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. MissMarple said, "Who saw him?" Slack answered, "Constable Lake. He was on patrol nearby." Lake confirmed, "I saw Draper at the back door." It was exactly midnight. MissMarple asked, "Did he say why he was there?" Lake shook his head. "Number." He entered quickly and locked the door behind him. Slack said, "That is suspicious. No one should be in the station at that time." MissMarple looked thoughtful. "What did Draper do inside?" Slack said, "We don't know." The CCTV cameras in the station were not recording between 3 a.m. and 3 a.m., 5 minutes. MissMarple nodded slowly. "Someone tampered with the tapes." Slack said, "Draper was there long before that." MissMarple asked, "How long did he stay?" Slack replied, "About an hour." Left at 1 a.m. MissMarple said, "What was he doing all that time?" Slack shrugged. "We don't have answers." MissMarple looked at Draper's personnel file. "Did he have a history of working late?" Slack said, "No. He usually leaves on time." MissMarple said, "Then why this night?" Slack said, "There is no note." No explanation. MissMarple said, "Could Draper be hiding something?" Slack said, "Possibly." MissMarple said, "Who else knew about his visit?" Slack replied, "Only Iris Farrow, the clerk. She saw him leave in the morning." MissMarple said, "Did she report anything unusual?" Slack said, "She said Draper looked tired but said nothing else." MissMarple said, "This visit raises questions." Slack said, "Yes." Why was Draper alone at night? MissMarple looked at the door. "What did he do, and why?" Slack said, "We must find out." MissMarple nodded. "The night holds answers." Why was Draper there alone at night? Iris Farrow sat in the office. MissMarple and Inspector Ridley waited. Iris looked nervous. She took a deep breath. "Sergeant Draper asked me to swap a CCTV tape." MissMarple leaned forward. "When was this?" Iris said, "At 3 a.m., the same night as the blackout." Ridley asked, "Did you see the tape before swapping?" Iris shook her head. "Number Draper handed me a blank tape and told me to replace the old one." MissMarple said, "Did you ask why?" Iris nodded. "He said it was for a training video. He needed the tape immediately." Ridley frowned. "Was this a normal procedure?" Iris replied, "No. Usually the tapes are handled by the chief or inspector." MissMarple said, "Who else knew about this?" Iris said, "Only Draper told me. I wasn't supposed to tell anyone." Slack said, "Why would Draper do this in the middle of the night?" Iris looked down. "I don't know, but I trusted him." MissMarple said, "Did you notice anything unusual about Draper that night?" Iris thought. He seemed tense. His hands shook a little. Ridley asked, "Did Draper give you any instructions about the tape?" Iris replied, "Only to keep it secret." MissMarple said, "You complied?" Iris nodded. "Yes." Slack said, "Do you think he was covering something up?" Iris looked scared. "Maybe." MissMarple said, "The tape is evidence. If it's switched, someone wants to hide the truth." Ridley said, "We need the original tape." Iris said, "I don't know where it is." Miss Marple said, "This act raises more questions." She looked at Draper. "What are you hiding?" Slack said, "Draper is the only one who gave her the new tape." Miss Marple nodded. "We must find the original footage." Iris said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell sooner." Miss Marple said, "It's not your fault. You were following orders." Ridley said, "This tape switch could change everything." Miss Marple said, "The truth is buried in that missing tape." Was Draper covering up evidence? Miss Marple sat across from Constable Pike. Pike's hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple looked at her carefully. "The keys you carry show gunpowder residue." Pike swallowed hard. "I never fired a gun." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you." Pike looked surprised. "Then why do the keys have residue?" Miss Marple said, "Someone may be trying to frame you." Pike shook her head. "But who? And why?" Miss Marple asked, "Have you noticed anyone acting strange around you?" Pike thought. "Sergeant Draper was always watching me closely." Miss Marple said, "You think he might want you to take the blame?" Pike looked down. "He's been harsh, but I don't know." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Someone wanted to shift suspicion." Pike's voice was quiet. "Maybe to protect themselves." Miss Marple said, "The oil on your keys was fresh, and gunpowder residue doesn't appear by accident." Pike said, "I didn't touch anything strange." Miss Marple said, "Your innocence is clear to me. But the evidence is against you." Pike looked scared. "I'm afraid they will arrest me." Miss Marple said, "We must find who planted the evidence." Pike nodded. "Please help me." Miss Marple stood. "We will." She looked around the room. "This is bigger than one person." Pike asked, "Who wants me to fall?" Miss Marple said, "Someone desperate. Someone hiding the truth." She paused, "and willing to ruin you to keep it." Slack entered the room. "We found new fingerprints on the cell door." Miss Marple said, "Another piece of the puzzle." She turned to Pike. "Stay strong." Pike nodded silently. "Who wants Pike to take the fall?" Miss Marple sat quietly. She reviewed all the evidence again. The oil on the lock, the fingerprints on the keys, the 2 rosters, the burned papers, the missing revolver, the switched tape. Each piece fit like a part of a puzzle. She thought about Sergeant Draper's actions, his late-night visits, the swapped tapes, the fresh oil, the falsified records. Miss Marple said to herself, "Everything points to one man." She looked at the files again. Draper's pension problems. His desperation was clear. Miss Marple knew people act differently under pressure. She thought about the note found in Draper's locker. "If something happens to me, check Roscoe's cell." That note was a warning. Miss Marple spoke softly. Draper tried to cover his tracks. She studied the timeline, the locked cell, the missing gun, the oil on the lock. She saw how the oil trapped the residue, how the fingerprints were planted. Miss Marple thought, the gun was taken and returned during the tape blackout. She thought about Pike being framed. The evidence was manipulated. Miss Marple said aloud, "Draper planned this carefully." She stood up, but he made mistakes. She looked around the station. Everyone waited for answers. Miss Marple said, "The pieces are in place." She paused. "The killer is close to being exposed." Miss Marple took a deep breath. "It's time. Is the killer about to be exposed?" Miss Marple and Inspector Slack waited in the interrogation room. Sergeant Draper was brought in. His hands shook. Miss Marple looked at Draper. "We have found evidence against you." Draper sat down slowly. He wiped sweat from his forehead. Slack said, "We know about the oil, the fake rosters, the missing revolver." Draper looked down. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple said, "You were at the station late at night." Draper swallowed, hard. "I needed to fix some papers." Slack said, You swapped CCTV tapes. Draper's voice was weak. I didn't want to cause trouble. MissMarple said, Eddie Roscoe was shot in a locked cell. Draper's face changed. I didn't kill him. MissMarple leaned forward. Then explain the fingerprints and the oil. Draper looked away. I was scared. I made mistakes. Slack said, mistakes or lies. Draper's eyes filled with tears. I tried to protect myself. MissMarple said, protecting yourself cost a life. Draper whispered, I didn't mean for this to happen. Slack said, who else was involved? Draper shook his head. No one, it was me. MissMarple said, why frame Constable Pike? Draper said, I thought she would cover for me. I was desperate. Slack said, your lies made things worse. MissMarple said softly, you must face the truth. Draper nodded slowly. I am ready. MissMarple said, then tell us everything. Draper took a deep breath. It started with the pension issue. He told the story, his fear, his actions. MissMarple listened carefully. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, the truth is painful, but justice is clear. Slack said, you will be charged. Draper lowered his head. I accept. MissMarple looked at Slack. This case is almost over. Will he admit or deny? The case was closed. Sergeant Draper was arrested. The truth was clear. MissMarple sat alone in the quiet station. She thought about what had happened. A man desperate for money made mistakes. Those mistakes cost a life. MissMarple wondered about desperation, how it changes people. She thought about Sergeant Draper, an honest man pushed too far. She thought about Constable Pike, framed but innocent. MissMarple looked at the empty cell where Eddie Roscoe died. She thought about justice, how it is sometimes slow, how it is sometimes harsh, but necessary. MissMarple thought about the evidence, oil, fingerprints, tapes, all used to hide the truth. But in the end, the truth came out. She wondered how often truth is hidden like this. How many lives are ruined by lies? MissMarple felt sadness for the victim, for the accused. She thought about human weakness, how pressure breaks people. She thought about how society judges. MissMarple stood up. She looked outside the window. The sun was setting. She knew the law was served, but justice is not only law. It is also understanding. MissMarple thought quietly, we must learn from this. She left the station slowly. The streets were calm, but her mind was busy. She hoped lessons were learned. She hoped no more lives would be lost this way. MissMarple walked away, ready for the next case. A quiet, emotional reflection on consequences and human frailty.